Think Different. This is a series that we began, I think we're week 4. And really where it stems from is this, is Jesus at the front end of his public ministry, as his friend Matthew records in his eyewitness account or biography of Jesus' life. There's a series of talks or a single talk, whatever it is, that we know as the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus used this teaching technique over and again. He will say things like, "You have heard it said," and then he'll finish it, "but I tell you," and what he's really telling and encouraging is the group of people that are on the side of the hill to think different. Like maybe what you thought about that is something that you were taught or trained, maybe never thought through it yourself. Maybe there's more to it than what you thought. Maybe it's something way different than you thought. So pause for just a little bit and think different. Okay, so now I've got to do this. I need to push back on somebody, won't name names, who is certain that I am grammatically challenged. That should be think differently. You're wrong. And I'm upset with you. I'm going to straighten you out. Okay? All right. Where it actually comes from, if you're with me on this, is an ancient Apple ad campaign that, Einstein was part of the deal here. So, think different. This was the idea that Apple had, that they were not just another computer company. They didn't want you to think about it the same way. They wanted you to think different things. Not just think differently, think different things. So to my distractor, I want to tell you that possibly you have forgotten that there is an adjective that can actually be a substantive adjective. This is why you come here, to get this kind of high-level training. So substantive adjectives are adjectives which are used alone without the noun that they're describing. For example, good, bad, and ugly, in the sentence the good, the bad, and the ugly, really is saying the good people, the bad people, and the ugly people. There you have it, right? So in this case, what Apple is saying is think different things. Not just think differently, don't just tweak your thinking, don't add something to it, which incidentally is what Jesus is saying on the Sermon on the Mount. He isn't just saying think differently. No, think different things. That's a different process. That's a different way to consider it. Like, for example, a couple of weeks ago we talked about anger, where Jesus says anger and murder are kind of in the same family. Well, that would be a bit of a different thought process, right? What he's saying is anger, which can lead to contempt, will lead to murder. Now, not all anger leads to murder, but all murder starts with anger. And what he's trying to say is think different things. Like, don't try to not be angry. That's not the solution to anger. He's saying this is what the solution is. Get to know how Jesus thinks, who he is, how he processes life, how he views things, how he handles anger himself. But more than that, get to know him for who he is. Fall in love with the wonder of who he is. Spend time, devote time to be alone with him and let him communicate with you and talk with you and share his thoughts with you and shape you and form you and cause you to think increasingly like he thinks. And as you and I increasingly think like he thinks, guess what? We ratchet that murder thing all the way back over here, and we become aware of proper ways, healthy ways to deal with anger. So don't just think differently, think different things. So last weekend, we picked up that same kind of process of thinking as it applies to another subject matter, still part of Jesus' thinking, but this had to do with lust and adultery. And to which Jesus would say, don't just think differently about lust and adultery, think different things. Think that all lust is adultery. Okay, but don't try to stop lusting. It won't work. You got to think different things. Here's what you think. Increasingly so. You could think that lust is really an internal indication that you're deeply searching even starving to love and be loved, and that this love is actually, in very real terms, found in Jesus Christ alone. By knowing and encountering the love that God has for you through the life of Jesus in a deeply personal way. That is thinking different things, not thinking differently. Last week's text, we were clear that Jesus was speaking to men specifically. And so we covered it from that basis. What he was telling us, guys, is that to him, lust is adultery. And the reason it's such a big deal to him, and he brings it out, is that it dehumanizes and objectifies women who, like every human being, are of immeasurable worth and value to him, and he will have none of it. But rather than just point his finger or stick his finger in our chest and say, stop it, he says, roll back, get to know me and the love I have for you, which you're searching for and you're starved for. And it'll change the way you think about women. Now, here's the thing. I didn't finish the line of thought that Jesus had last week. Focused just on the lust part, but there's a second piece that Jesus speaks about, and I would like to cover that with you this morning. So, verse 28 of Matthew 5, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, is the statement we looked at last week, which is, you must not commit adultery, and then he goes to talk about lust. In verse 31, just the next section from it, this is what he says. Verse 31 and 32 of chapter 5, he says, you have also heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. So, just pause here for a second before we dissect that, kind of go line by line through it. Something really important to understand here. Jesus, and then later his friend Paul, the prolific first century writer, they both talk about divorce. But what they're not discussing is what today we call divorce. Neither Jesus nor Paul dealt with divorce or separation by mutual consent. Wasn't there. Or in cases where provision is made by a division of property or alimony or otherwise, not there. They did not deal with it in those kinds of terms because it did not exist in the first century. There's something else that Jesus and Paul are talking about when they think about divorce. It's not the same definition that you and I would use today. Divorce meant this, to put away someone, to put away your wife is really what it's referring to. So just to repeat, there is no prohibition of divorce as we know it, except this is true from then as it is today. In so many cases, in most cases, it consistently ends in hurtful putting away of one or both of the parties. That's the consistent piece. But the divorce definition is a little different. So, with that backdrop, can we go look at verse 31 here? This is what it says again. You have heard the law that says a man can divorce or put away or send away his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. Now, that is not one of the 10 commandments. Last week's was Article 7 of the 10 commandments. This is not in the 10 commandments. Article 7 was you must not commit adultery, and then Jesus talks about lust. You must not commit adultery is assumed here, and you must have the right definition, understanding of divorce is what he would say. In other words, to be true to the text, what Jesus is saying is you must not commit adultery, and now let me apply those situations to where a man sends away his wife. Now, unlike for us, those whom Jesus is speaking to on the hillside would have known exactly where that text that he recites is found. They know it's not in the 10 Commandments. As I've just said, it's not in the 10 Commandments. So where then is it found? And why does that matter? Well, here's how it worked in Jesus' day. The scriptures were transmitted orally, not written down. And so if Jesus would begin to recite an Old Testament passage of Scripture, those on the hillside would have gone, let me finish it. I know how that ends. Because since they were little kids, they were taught to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible. So in this case, Jesus recites something from the first 5 books of the Bible that's not the 10 Commandments, but it's written there, and the folks on the hill would have gone, let me finish it. They would have known exactly where Jesus was going with this. We do this too, by the way. Can I give you a couple of examples? Our Father, who art, hallowed, thy. See, we do the same thing. Try this one. The Lord is my, I shall. He leads me. There we go. Same thing. For God so that he. See, we do the same thing. We know some passages really well, and that's what Jesus would be doing here. He didn't tell them the whole passage. He didn't give all the background. Can I tell you where he found it? I'm going to anyways. So here we go. It's actually found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, the first 4 verses, and this is what it says. Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. This is Jesus quoting this. Having discovered something wrong with her, he writes her a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. That's essentially what he says in Matthew's account, right? It goes on. When she leaves his house, she's free to marry another man. But if the second husband also turns against her, writes a document of divorce, hands it to her, and sends her away, or if he dies, the first husband may not marry her again, for she has been defiled. That would be detestable to the Lord. You must not bring guilt upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as a special possession. So it's not one of the 10 Commandments, it's case law. It's something a little different. It's not about if and when it's okay to divorce and an explanation of God's law behind that. It's about 2 other things. Here's one of the things that it's, what is it that leads to divorce? That's one of the questions that's being answered in this, and I think that's why Jesus brings it back. And then there's a second thing, and it has to do with what happens after divorce happens. What's the proper process from there? How do we handle that? So first of all, what he's talking about is what leads to divorce. How did we get here? Now, Jesus doesn't name specific incidents and infractions that lead to divorce. Infidelity is probably assumed here, but it could be abandonment, abuse, and that's physical, emotional, mental, verbal, psychological. But what he does do is he points upstream from the divorce and goes, the problem's that way. It's upstream from here. Just like he said murder, the problem's upstream from here. Lust, the problem's upstream from here. So where's the problem he's pointing to? What is it that he would say, this is how you got here? Well, in the first part of verse 1 of Deuteronomy 24, he says, suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him. There's the problem. Now, stop for just a second. Lest you would think the problem is her for not pleasing him, that's an entire misread of this passage. The problem is his problem. Something's happened inside of him where she's not pleasing to him any longer. Now, she might have contributed to it, but that's not the point that is trying to be made here. It is something happened where he's concluded in his own mind, you no longer please me, I don't need to keep you around anymore. It's that direct. I have to tell you, I don't know of a single couple who stood in front of friends and family and God, like the couple I officiated at a wedding yesterday, where they said, I am getting married to the person I love and who pleases me, so that one day they won't please me anymore and we can get a divorce. This doesn't happen. It's not the intent. Sure, they might be afraid that it could end that way. They may not have the skills to have a healthy, mutually pleasing marriage. That's possible. They may go through unimaginable experiences that threaten their marriage. They may even not love each other when they're getting married. But we do not marry as a normal pattern to divorce, to send someone away. We would never get married if that's what we thought we were headed for. We are more likely to marry for the wrong reason than we are to divorce for the wrong reason. Jesus is just pointing out that adultery starts with lust. He just pointed that out last week, right? He does not give us all of the various steps between, but adultery simply does not start with adultery, and divorce simply does not start with thoughts of divorce or getting out. It's not the starting point, and this is what he wants to point out. Jesus is actually pointing all the way back to anger that leads to contempt, that leads to lust, that leads to adultery, or leads to divorce. It's one continuous thought that he has. He's saying it starts way back there. And in some cases, it leads to lust and adultery. In other cases, it leads to divorce. But it all starts back there with something around anger and contempt. Professor John Gottman, professor at University of Washington, has studied marriage and marriage relationships for 30 or so years. I discovered him this last couple of weeks as I was preparing for this. 15 years ago, he tried a really cool, interesting experiment, at least it was to me. He rented an apartment in Seattle, I think it was. It was someplace in the Pacific Northwest. And he used it as kind of a B&B laboratory to see how couples related to each other in marriage. This is what he would do, and there are thousands of people that have gone through this. He would invite them to come for a 24-hour period to stay at his B&B laboratory. And they would do normal life as a couple for 24 hours. These were couples that had been recently married a long time, older couples, younger couples, all kinds of couples were part of this. Since for 24 hours, they would live like they would normally live in this B&B laboratory. They would watch TV and eat and sleep and play games and read and argue and discuss just like they would in their normal home. Except for one thing, they did it under the gaze of research psychologists watching on 4 cameras and recording what they discovered. Over those 15 years, Dr. Gottman discovered some things, and he recently put it in a book that he entitled The 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Interesting title, right? In it, he says that his clinical research has shown him that there are 4 relational attributes that when they're there, he can predict with 85% certainty that that couple will divorce. What a wonderful thing to give your life to. And he would say the 4th one that he discovered, the 4th one is the most deadly of the 4. Do you want the 4? Sure you do. You want to check if you've got them. So here's the first one, no surprise, is criticism. That is turning an undesirable behavior you see in your spouse and making it a personal fault or failure or irredeemable quality. So it moves from just undesirable behavior to something personal about them. Second is defensiveness. That's blaming and playing the victim during difficult circumstances. It's her fault. She did it. He did it. I wouldn't be this way if he wasn't that way. Third is stonewalling. That is blocking off conversation by silence or being irrationally argumentative. She never does that. He always does that. It's always her fault. It's always his fault. And here's the 4th one. I found this one really interesting. It's what he would call the kiss of death. And that is contempt. That is seeing your spouse as worthless or worth less than you. Now, Dr. Gottman grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family. He didn't grow up as a student of Jesus' teaching, and yet his conclusions are exactly the same as Jesus. Anger that is unchecked leads to contempt, which almost always leads to the sending away of the spouse. Started here, not there. And this is what he reveals for us. Now, I want to stay true to our text, but this struck me this last couple of weeks. I don't want to drift away from it. But have you noticed, not just in marriage, but in culture, society, your relationships as a whole, how prevalent a divorce mindset or pattern of divorce thinking in our culture as a whole is, not just marriage. We have such a hard time disagreeing with each other without divorcing each other. We're also quick to break off relationships with people who disagree with us. We avoid those who see the world in other colors than we do, who have different solutions, different ideas, preferences, and desires than us. And it's simply just easier to send you away. And we do that at the highest levels of our country. And we do it all the way down into the places where we live and we work. We do it on our teams, in our classrooms, in boardrooms, on the production floor, and we even do it in churches. It happens between parents and kids, siblings, best friends. It is this idea that if we disagree, then by necessity, we need to move away from one another. It's very, very dangerous form of contempt. That I am worth more than you are. And it leads to a divorce culture. Divorce, the putting away, never really starts with divorce. You see, what Jesus is doing in this Sermon on the Mount is actually not preaching a sermon or giving some pointers on where, under what circumstances divorce is acceptable and when it is not. He gives a little more insight, if you're interested, a little further in Matthew's account in chapter 19. There's a section in there. But here in this particular text, he is not so much preaching a sermon as he's trying to build a community of people who, long before they begin to ideate about divorce, are self-aware enough that they roll back the thinking over here. And this is where they begin. When anger pops up, when hurt happens, when disappointment occurs, when things start to go awry, where criticism starts to get amped up, they deal with it over here. Do you know that the average couple in America waits 7 years from the first time that danger appears on the horizon till they go ask for help? There's so much that happens in the meantime, where if we could be part of the kind of community, the kingdom of God that Jesus would talk about, he would say, no, we're going to build a community where hurt doesn't fester, where criticism doesn't stay, where we get help from one another. In fact, he would say, if you'll draw close to me, if you'll come close to me, and you'll spend time, actually put time on your calendar where we're together, and you listen to me and I listen to you, and you read the Bible not as a textbook but as something where I reveal myself to you, and you give the Spirit room in your heart to reveal who I am. Do you know that there's a displacement that's going to happen in your soul? You're going to be increasingly thinking like me, and there's far less chance. In fact, there's decreased chance exponentially that we're going to end up over here. So come, think different things. Don't try to avoid divorce. Think different things. Draw close and I'll draw close, he says. So Jesus is trying to point out here that divorce starts much earlier up the pathway. There's a second thing that he's trying to point out in this passage. I believe that he quotes from the Old Testament. Let's go back to it. And it's in the same verse, just the second part of it. Suppose a man marries a woman, but she does not please him, having discovered something wrong or indecent with her. The New Living that we use uses the word something wrong. The actual word is indecent. And every single time that it's used, it is about some sexual misbehavior that has occurred. In this case, it's very likely adultery, infidelity of some kind. So what Moses and God were working out when they wrote this was that there's a way to handle that when it happens. You see, the culture around Moses at the time, 1,500 years before Jesus quotes it, do you know what the culture of it was? Way back then, 300 years prior to that, so around 2,000 years before Jesus was around, there was a king who developed a code of conduct called Hammurabi. You might have heard of the Hammurabi Code. It was how to do relationships, how to do business, how to pay bills, how to collect them, those kinds of basic principles. And they had a basic idea that it was this: if your spouse, if your wife, and wife only, because wives couldn't do it the other way around, if she's unfaithful to you, if she commits adultery, here's what you do. You bind her up, you tie her up, put her in a bag, and drop her in a body of water. That's what you do. That's how you do relationships. That's the Hammurabi Code. Really? Yeah, really. Moses and God work on something and they go, okay, so if your wife commits adultery, don't kill her. You actually have to tell people that. Really, you do. He says, no, you don't do that. The culture around you deals with this stuff that way, not you. What you do is you don't stay in it, but you write a letter, a certificate, a document of divorce so that her life is redeemable. Because if you don't, nobody will know who owns her. I said it, owns her, like a thing owns her. Because it's just disturbing to even describe it that way, isn't it? But that's how she was thought of, as an object or a thing. And what God is saying, no. There has to be a way back for her to be redeemed. There has to be. Yes, she did that. But the way back is for her to have her freedom from you so that she can marry another person, so she can find a way to live other than living on the street or trying to. You have to make a way for her life to be redeemed. That's the nature of our God. So different from the culture. And this is what Jesus is quoting to his friends. It was the only chance for her to reestablish any kind of life for herself after divorce. God told Moses that in spite of what the culture around was doing, in spite of the damage of adultery, you need to give her every chance to have some path of redemption. Now you need to know this. This subject matter of divorce and remarriage was a hot button, controversial subject in Jesus' day. It was a matter of what was being discussed in the airwaves, and CNN and Fox News were covering it, and the local newspapers were covering it, and well, they didn't have those. But wherever news reports were sent out, and wherever conversation and dialogue and debate happened, this subject of divorce and remarriage was a hot button idea that was talked about. We have to get a little history here and understand that just as in our day, cultural context always helps figure out what our theology is going to be practically, right? There's a practical sense of what Jesus is saying here. You see, this is what happened. A generation before Jesus' birth, like about 30 BC, a rabbi named Hillel, or Hillel the Elder, was the most significant voice in their culture. Everybody was listening to Hillel. He was on all the airwaves, he was in all the newspapers, he was blogging, he was everywhere you were hearing about Hillel. Now, he became revered within the Hebrew culture in that time frame. In fact, he was associated or linked with someone of Moses' stature. That's how big a deal he was. In fact, there were some parallels between Hillel and Moses. Both these men lived to be 120 years old, incidentally. The first 40 years of Hillel's life was spent away from Israel. Moses, 40 years in Egypt, away from the family of Israel. The next 40 years, Hillel is a student, a study. He comes back to Israel and he learns the Hebrew scriptures and he's a student of the scriptures. And then when he's 80 years old, he goes public. How old was Moses when he went public? 80 years old. So there's some linkage there. Hillel was the most significant spiritual voice, kind of the spiritual leader of Israel the next 40 years. Why do I bring all of that up? Well, Hillel taught about divorce and remarriage as one of the central themes of what he talked about. And when he did, he quoted Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. It's exactly the passage Jesus quoted in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Okay, got to track with me now. What he said that passage gave was freedom to have a no-fault divorce, an easy divorce, a simple divorce. He understood it this way, that if your wife doesn't please you anymore, send her away. For whatever the reason is. That's how he interpreted it. And that gained traction in the generation before Jesus, and it was still a hot button. So what's Jesus doing? He's talking about a cultural issue that's real for him and trying to give some direction from the scripture and how he understands it to be. The consequences of Hillel's teaching was this, is that you could send a woman away for anything. like she burned the pork chops. Actually, she probably didn't burn pork chops, right? Right. You could send her away for not being able to bear children. How painful would that be, right? You could send her away for gaining a few pounds and for not being sexually pleasing to the husband. And this is what Hillel taught. And Jesus steps into it and he says, that is not right. You see, if that happened to a woman, there were really only three options. One, she might find a home within the home of a generous relative, but she would always kind of be like second rate and often found themselves as slaves within the family. She might find a man to marry her, since typically you didn't marry for love, you married for ability to bear children and help out. She always would have been damaged goods. Or oftentimes what happened, she would find her place in the community as a prostitute or a sex slave. And Jesus comes along and says, no, that's not the way it works in the community of God. It just doesn't do that. We don't do that. This last December, Elfie and I were in Israel, and we heard the stories of some Orthodox Jewish people. And you'll get a bit of a sense, I think this will be kind of abhorrent for you to think about, but maybe you'll get a bit of a sense of how upset Jesus would have been with this. It's not uncommon with some Orthodox Jews for the husband to seek sexual pleasure outside of his marriage. So let's say he lives in Jerusalem and is going to go to Tel Aviv for the weekend. He will take a clergyman with him, because divorce and remarriage are a religious legal thing. He will take that clergyman with him to Tel Aviv, where he will give that man a divorce and remarry him to a prostitute, because sex outside of marriage is wrong. They will have their experience together, then he will divorce him from that prostitute and remarry him to his wife. Is that abhorrent? Does that make you shudder? Is that objectification at its worst? You get a bit of a sense how Jesus says, no way. That's not how this works. It just can't work that way. Verse 32 says, but I say that a man who divorces his wife unless she has been unfaithful causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. It's like Jesus is saying, look, I know what you hear from liberal media, social scientists, and from left-leaning religious leaders. You hear this, that a man can arbitrarily divorce, send away a woman for any reason, but that is simply not the right way to interpret this. In my view, Jesus would be saying, just like you know the horror and hurt and pain that you feel if your wife slept with another man, you are doing that to her and to God when you send her away for any reason other than adultery. And even if it is adultery, you must give her a chance at redemption, or you will in all likelihood be forcing her into further adultery so she can just survive. Jesus is not giving an in-depth, comprehensive teaching on divorce and remarriage. The passage is confusing to us if we think that Jesus is answering, when can I get a divorce? Or under what circumstances can I remarry? He is weighing in on a raging social issue of his day and explaining that in his kingdom, he is bringing a new way of thinking to bear on this. Not just thinking differently, but to think different things. In his kingdom, we do not treat women or each other with contempt, because it inevitably leads to seeing women and each other as objects and things, or leads to putting others away in marriage or in real life, and leads to divorce of all kinds. Jesus is calling us, his followers, to a whole different way of thinking about human relationships of all kinds, but especially relationships between men and women, and especially in marriage. So where do we go? How do we land this? Brad, just sit down. You're over time, okay? Can I land it this way? Jesus is asking us to rethink where the roots of lust and easy divorce are drawing their strength from. And he points way up the stream to the headwaters of unrestrained anger and contempt. I think it is an invitation. No, I think it's a call. It's a plea from Jesus for us guys, to go to the headwaters of where that starts. And it has simply to do with honoring women in our world. to treat them with gentleness and with kindness, as precious human treasures and immeasurably worthy sisters. A little later in the Bible, Paul, the writer we mentioned earlier, would say to some married guys, to us, he would say, guys, when it comes to how you treat your wives, you love them. And then he adds this, love them like Christ loves the church and gave himself up for her. Guys, can I suggest something? You want to take this seriously? Like, you really want to take it seriously? Book a day off work this week and go away by yourself and think about how Jesus loves the church. While you were yet sinners, Christ died for you. That means he goes first. Even when he's right and we're wrong, he still went first to reconcile us. That's what loving our wives, it means going first. First to apologize, the first to own up, the first to fess up, the first to go, the first to be contrite, the first to admit, the first. It just goes first. That's what it means. There's no limit to how far we go. Like, he gave his life. What would it look like if we treated our wives with a willingness to go that far to love her? But that takes thought. It takes time with Jesus. It takes time to sit alone in silence with him way upstream and go, so Jesus, this is what you wrote. What does it mean for me? How do I do it in my home? How do I do it in my marriage? Guys, it might be the best one-day deal with Jesus you've ever given your life to. To the young men in our group who are not yet married, don't expect to do that once you are married if you aren't interested in doing it before you're married. Treat your girlfriends. Treat the other young ladies around you with the utmost honor and the utmost respect. To our dads, show your boys what it means to love a woman with honor, and show your girls how she should expect to be treated by a guy. And do it by how you treat them in your home. Women, honor your bodies by not making them the object of your affection. There's a cultural standard of beauty that you will run into from time to time, and you'll often compare yourself to that or be compared to it by men, and as you all know all too well, by women as well. It's a plastic standard, it's a lie, it's a great deception. Your real beauty lies in your soul and who you are. Give at least as much attention to your soul as you do to your body. And pass that truth on to our young women. Teach and model for them about the power of inner beauty that results in confidence and grace and modesty. And then above all, I believe this whole talk that Jesus is giving, it's him trying to explain how we treat each other when we live in close proximity to him. It's really an invitation to do life with him, to block out, set aside, to be alone with him, to worship him, to discover the wonder and beauty of who he is, to fall in love over and over again. In John 3:30, there's this great passage where John is telling his friends, when it comes to Jesus, he must become more and more, and I must become less and less. And that order is really significant. Don't ever get that mixed up. Don't ever try to think, I must become less and less so he can become more and more. It won't happen. Because when you try to become less and less, who are you thinking about? Yourself. But when you turn that around, as John does, just think more and more about him. Think the wonder, the beauty, the majesty, the care, how he's everything. He is the source of love. He's the source of hope. He's absolutely everything. Guess who gets lost in the deal? You and me. It's a displacement thing. And then we find out who we truly are. And we live in the kingdom with Jesus. And this is what he's designed for us. Now, Jesus, would you walk this journey with us? Sitting in this room today, I'm sure are some among us who live with some regret and disappointment how things have turned out along the way. Relationships that haven't worked. First loves that became enemies along the way. They didn't set out to do that. That isn't what they hoped for. Jesus, you know, when they stood at an altar, they were fully intent to find delight and pleasure in each other and to love faithfully and honorably their whole life. But you know us, you know we're dust, you know we're weak. We make mistakes, we get sideways, some truths that we know we can't seem to appropriate in our lives. So I thank you this morning for your redemptive mercy. I thank you that you restore and you actually take the things that didn't work out for us and some of it our own fault, and you do redeem it and you make something good and beautiful out of it. There's not a situation where you can't do that. But Jesus, would we be a group of people who walk with you, who intentionally spend time with you, listen for your voice, dialogue with you as a friend, listen as a friend, obey when there's a prompting, read the text of the scripture as something that can be used to shape, and just increasingly think like you, Jesus. Would you do that among us? Would you do it for our sake? But would you do it in your name? And we'll be grateful for it. Amen.